Hi, today we're going to look at Karl Marx, and we're using a reading from the manifesto of the Communist Party. But before we look at Marx, we're going to just briefly mention the philosopher Hegel. He died in 1830, so overlapping a little bit with Marx, but Hegel gives a philosophy of history that shapes Marxist thought. And Hegel's philosophy of history, briefly, is just this, that is a philosophy of how does change occur. So it occurs through conflict, through challenges and responses. And what happens is this: there's a thesis, which is challenged by an antithesis. And in that process of conflict, a synthesis emerges, which then goes on to have its own antithesis. So there's another challenge, which produces a synthesis, and so on. Now, Hegel puts that into his idealist philosophy, and we can look at that elsewhere. Marx uses that idea of conflict and puts it into his materialist philosophy. And so he's only going to consider this in terms of the material world, humans as just material objects, and motivated by economics. So economics and politics understood as economics especially, and how that produces change in society. So let me give an example actually towards the end of our reading. And then we'll go back. So he says here, all previous historical movements were movements of minorities in the interest of the minorities. And hitherto, every form of society has been based, as we've already seen, on the antagonism of oppressing and oppressed classes. So that's how he's viewing it. That's the thesis and antithesis that he's thinking of that will produce that change in history. And the minorities, he's thinking of particularly economic. So he's going to give us a history in this section or reading of how those occur, how that change occurs. So as we get into Marx, you want to think about what is his philosophy, how is what he's saying nested within other beliefs about the world. So he's a materialist. Only the material world exists, and the material world has existed from eternity. So human nature is analyzed just in terms of the material side of things. Humans are basically economic in the sense that they have wants and desires, and they try to fulfill those desires. And he can explain those materially. And then human society is just that conflict. So a good society is one where those are satisfied. And so we'll look and see, how do we get to the good society? Well, for Marx, it's through revolution. He is part of what we'll call this the revolutionary utopianism. He's trying to achieve the good society through revolution and revolt and the violence that comes with those. And it's such a part of the modern world that people might take that for granted and think, yeah, isn't that how you do it? Well, no, you don't have to do it that way. How about through reason and argument? Offering persuasive arguments that change people's minds and convince them of the truth. That's a different way to achieve a good society. So when we look at the history of Marx, the history of Marxist revolutions, we'll see that's not what they do. They rely on violent upheaval and revolution to destroy the previous order and put a new order in its place. Let's look at how he explains this. So the first line, like the one I just quoted towards the end, the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Now, is that right? Well, it's going to depend on what you mean by class and struggle. Right? So that's the philosopher's answer is, well, it depends what you mean by that. Here he means classes. He means economic classes. Now, those might overlap with other kinds of classes, but the basis of them is economic. And so struggle is economic. All society has been a struggle economically. Now, you could think about it as this way. We could look at Thomas Hobbes, who talks about this as well, that there's this struggle. Life is short, brutish, and nasty. And so say, yeah, isn't that right? Society is based on history of class struggles. Well, even if we grant, okay, there's always been conflict in society, we could put a question mark by that, because we could say, was that how it was originally meant to be? He says, all hitherto existing society. Is that right? All, or some, even if it's most hitherto existing society, because of an original problem that came up. So we're going to leave a question mark by that. I'm trying to raise a question about his materialism here and his assumption that things have always been this way. How do we know they've always been this way? Maybe in the beginning it was different. But it's essential and important to zero in on history of class struggles. Is that right? Now, that might be one of the struggles, but is that getting to the basic struggle? That's maybe how we should think about this, ordering it. There has been this struggle, but it hasn't been, but it's explained by another struggle in the human heart. And that comes out in various ways, in relationships, in religion, in politics, in economics, in business, economics, business, family. All of these have struggles because of something else going on in the human. So we'll see if does Marx get into that, or is he zeroing in on one specific thing, economic struggle, and making that into something that then overpronounces, overblows that, so that no, that's too much. That's not exactly how it works. So he names some of these: freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guild master and journeyman. In a word, oppressor and oppressed stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight that each time ended either in revolutionary reconstruction of society at large or in the common ruin of the contending classes. So that's interesting here, because the conflict is sometimes open, and there have been open fights about economics, no doubt about it, sometimes hidden. So you can't see it. So that way he can say it's always there, and you'll point to a time and say, no, it's not at this time. He'll say, oh, but it's hidden at that time. Now, is that the basic struggle between humans? I'm going to suggest the basic struggle is about meaning. How do we make sense of the world? And people come together in systems of how to do that. And that could mean that they come together in systems of meaning about as rich and poor, economically aligned though, or not aligned because there's rich and poor, but they're agreeing about how to make sense of the world. And that's what unites them. And that's what puts them in conflict with others, other systems of how to make sense of the world, how to find meaning. So economics emerges from that, but it's not the basic foundation. And so because Marx doesn't get back to meaning, his approach is not going to be cognitive, meaning having to do with beliefs or either true or false. It's going to be non-cognitive, having to do with appetites. And that's going to require the violent revolutions that come out of it, the violent overthrows. Because if it was cognitive, he could get back to beliefs. And he could say, look, you guys believe this about the world, and that's not true. You should believe this other thing about the world. And give an argument to support that. But he's not dealing at that level. And so he's dealing with human nature at a non-cognitive level, not getting back to how humans believe, what they believe about the world. He's also just kind of slipping in his beliefs about the world and doing that, which, as I said, is a kind of materialism. All right, so let's keep going into the details here. The modern bourgeois society that has sprouted from the ruins of feudal society has not done away with class antagonisms. It has but established new classes, new conditions of oppression, new forms of struggle in place of the old ones. Remember, there's always struggle. That's just like a beginning presupposition of his. He's not arguing from the data to that presupposition. He's using that presupposition and then interpreting all the data. So even if you show a time where, look, there's no class struggle here, he'll say, oh, but it's hidden. You can't see it. There's always new forms of struggle in place of the old ones. And what is that struggle? Economic. These people have, these people don't have. Stuff, money, property, etc. Because it could be this. What if these people have meaning and these people don't? And that doesn't always, maybe even rarely, aligns with economics. Rich people can be very depressed and have a sense of meaninglessness in their lives. Think of Hamlet, who was a prince. So he could do quite well for himself and just enjoy himself. But he's struggling with the meaning of life and how to make sense of some events that have happened in his life, the murder of his father. And he wants to know, what does this mean and how could I know what happened? So being rich doesn't provide meaning. That's the struggle in humans. And even if you had equal distribution of all property, you'd still have the problem of meaning. Or if you hit the big one, you won the lottery, you still have a struggle with meaning. Getting the money from the lottery doesn't provide your life with meaning. All right, so keep going in his history. Our epoch, the epoch of the bourgeoisie, possesses, however, the distinctive feature it has simplified the class antagonisms. So he does think history is coming to a point. It's not an endless, it is a problem here because he says it's eternal, matter's eternal without beginning. Somewhere along that line, human society started, But it doesn't just go on in the cycles of conflict forever. It's like a cyclical upward movement towards the good society. And we're nearing that point because we've simplified the antagonisms to two. Society as a whole is more and more splitting up into two great hostile camps. So once that conflict is over, there'll just be one, and that will be the utopian age. So this is sometimes called a secular millennialism, meaning in Christian theology, the millennium is when Christ rules. And there's the secular version here, when there's a good society ruling the earth. But it's secular. There's no sense of religion, no God, nothing besides the material world. And you'll see Marx uses a lot of Christian ideas, even though he's anti-Christian. So he's sometimes called a version of a Christian heresy, because he's using ideas like that. You'll see how they fit into the fall, into an original sin, into repentance from that, into salvation and what it takes for there to be a good society so humans can live together as loving their neighbor. So you'll see all of these, which are coming out of a Christian background, being put into just a purely materialist and economic understanding. And so what is good and evil? Want. And people who have too much and don't need it, well, that's evil. And they got it they may not have got it, inherited it from someone else. They didn't even work for it. And so that has to be redistributed to those who don't have. And that's what's good. And so what's interesting is sometimes you'll see Christian theology and then Marx taking that and taking out the anything that's not material. And then later, some Christians then using Marxist ideas back into Christianity. So it's an interesting sort of like movement, right? From Christian theology to Marxism to back to some Christian theology. And Marx famously said, religion is the opiate of the masses. Now we use opium to help us with pain, right? And that pain could be physical. Say you get prescribed morphine or something, but it could also just be existential. People abuse it because their life doesn't make sense, doesn't have meaning. So what he's saying is religion is used for that purpose. It dulls your senses because of the pain of life. But it's not really a solution. I mean, if you're taking morphine, it's not solving whatever health problem you have. It's just dulling your nerves for a while. And so especially what he's thinking of when he says religion, what he's thinking of is otherworldliness. So this life is miserable. It's full of suffering. And religion comes along and tells you, yeah, it is. But if you do these things, then you'll have a good afterlife. And that's when everything will be okay. So otherworldliness, the other world, the next life will make things better. And religions he thinks that's not actually every religion says that, but he thinks that's what religion is. And then they just have different versions of what is needed to get you a good afterlife. And he's saying, no, we need to make changes in this life. So he becomes arguing against otherworldliness. He offers a mere this worldliness, ignoring the afterlife. There is no afterlife, just this world. How do we make this world better? You only live once, it might say. So let's make this world better. So you can see the tension there between otherworldliness and mere this worldliness as a false dichotomy, because you don't have to choose between those two. You could say, yeah, that's right. We can make things better. We can know the good now. And knowing the good now is both for this life and the next life. Now, what's coming out here about Marx's view of the good? We'll see again, just economic view of the good. His view of the good is based on his view of human nature and that's based on what is real, the materialism. So humans, the good is fulfilling desires, and that's done economically, and the poor can't do that. So society is in conflict until the most people can fulfill their desires. And that's because humans are just material objects, because that's all there is, matter. So you see that pattern here they'll bring out in thinking. So again, let's keep going here in the history of his thought. The discovery of America, the rounding of the Cape, the opening of fresh ground for the rising bourgeoisie, the East Indian and the Chinese markets, the colonization of America, trade with the colonies, the increase in the means of exchange and in commodities generally, gave to commerce, to navigation, to industry, an impulse never before seen and thereby to the revolutionary element in the tottering feudal society, a rapid development. So markets opened up. He's thinking of global trade as the explanation of the modern world, and many people still do that. Colonization and the post-colonial world. Economically. Now, there's something else going on here in the Discovery of America that we could think of as explaining the modern world, which is religious impulse. Discovering America as finding a way to India around the Middle East. Discovering America as opening up places where missionaries went. So there's multiple motives for people expanding, not only economic, and they're mixed. The same person could do both, right? The same person could be a missionary and looking to increase wealth. Because here's why. You might be going, let's say you're going from England, and England's in a conflict with Spain. England being the Church of England and Spain being the Roman Church. And those two are in conflict. And so you're expanding, and if you're bringing back gold to England or to Spain, it's part of that larger conflict of religion to help either England in that conflict or Spain in that conflict. So the economics serves that religious conflict that was going on, the wars of religion at the time, and not the other way around, not religion serving economics. You're not simply going out into the world to get wealth in order to have wealth. You're getting it in order to support the conflict that's been going on since the Reformation, the wars of religion. So he doesn't consider that at all here. Religion, again, is only that otherworldliness. It's secondary. It's all economic. And you'll see still a lot of analysis of the modern world is purely in terms of economic colonization, which is going and getting economic goods simpliciter, not in any context of how are people making sense of the world? How are they understanding things? How is economics an expression of that? And it's actually in service to their other concerns, more deeply held concerns about the meaning of the world. So he thinks in terms of the markets keep growing and demand ever rising. Modern industry established the world market for which the discovery of America paved the way. So the modern bourgeoisie is itself the product of a long course of development of a series of revolutions in the modes of production and of exchange. So the bourgeoisie grows as its world market grows, and it wants to go into the world to get goods, to sell them, but you need more and more people to sell to. So it also goes into the world to expand the market, grow the market. So the bourgeoisie historically has played the most revolutionary part. And here he gives a history of how the bourgeoisie rose to power in contrast to the aristocracy and the feudal system. And it wants to set up free trade. Why? Well, one word, exploitation, veiled by religious and political illusions. It is substituted naked, shameless, direct, brutal exploitation. So here he has a reference to political or religious illusions, right? He dismisses them as not even real. In contrast to if you speak to the person, they would say, no, this is what really motivates my life. I'm really concerned about this issue. He says, no, that's just how they cover up their desire for exploitation and stuff. So is that right? It's interesting to see here similarities are with Marx and then later Freud, and analyzing how the humans do beliefs and how they have religion. Religion is a kind of justification or cover for more basic, what they might call primal instincts, because they're more like animals. They're without saying they're directly influenced by Darwin, because some of them overlap here. Marx and Darwin overlap. Darwin's also giving, interestingly, a kind of dialectic in the animal world of how animal species develop. More primal means going back to more basic ones. Eating and reproducing are our basic needs, and we use religion to cover that up and give it and make ourselves feel better about it. Now, that's all assuming this view of human nature. It's only true if that view of human nature is true, and that view of human nature is only true if the worldview about what is eternal is true. So it might strike you when you hear it, you might say, yeah, that is what humans are like, but that's because you probably have those same assumptions about the world, and we have to learn to look at those and analyze them. Is that true that we're basically just appetites? We do have appetites, but we also have a mind. And when our appetites are satisfied, we want more. So they're actually never satisfied. What does our mind want? What would satisfy our mind? So here, this brief and quick setting aside of religious and it's only economic. And so he goes through discusses the bourgeoisie revolution and the revolutionary age. The bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production and thereby the relations of production, and with them the whole relations of society. So how we produce the things we sell as property has to be constantly revolutionized. And that requires changing the whole relationship of how society works, from the feudal system, which to us in the 21st century would be unrecognizable if we had to live in it. None of the relationships would make sense to us because everything's had to be changed for the markets. And talks about change here. All that is solid melts into air. All that is holy is profaned. And man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relationship with his kind. So a theme in Marx is alienation. We've been alienated from ourselves and from others. And the systems of society cause that alienation. And when those are stripped away, melt into air, profaned, we're at last compelled, with sober sense, thoughtful senses, to see our real condition. So we cover that up. And that's interesting, right? What is our real condition? How are we able to see it? He's suggesting, for example, traditions of society. We get into those and those make us just be mindless. And that could be true. And we don't really reflect on our condition at all in that mindless state. And when those are taken away, then we have to actually see ourselves and no longer cover up our reality. So the need for constantly expanding market for its products chases the bourgeoisie over the whole surface of the globe. It must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere. So again, that's the motivation for global expansion. And there's interesting nationalist motivation here, in contrast to global expansion of the markets, which erases those things about humans. So the whole sort of, and that's the motivation. It's just markets, as opposed to, again, as I said, the markets are necessary to fund this other conflict, the wars of religion that are going on. They say, no, that's just cover for, we just want to expand markets for the sake of having markets. So the bourgeoisie, through its exploitation of the world market, given a cosmopolitan character in production and consumption to every country. So that's the erasing of other cultures for this bourgeoisie world market culture. All old established national industries have been destroyed or are daily being destroyed. They are dislodged by new industries, whose introduction becomes a life and death question for all civilized nations. And the bourgeoisie, by the rapid improvement of all instruments of production, by the immense facilitated means of communication, draws all, even the most barbarian nations, into civilization. So he has a sort of higher and lower view of different nations, right? Some are more civilized, some are still barbarians. And the markets is what draws us all into civilization, and it erases those national differences. The cheap prices of all commodities are the heavy artillery with which it batters down all Chinese walls, with which it forces the barbarians' intensely obstinate hatred of foreigners to capitulate. So the Great Wall of China, one of the best known features of the world, is not overcome by an actual army. It's overcome by economics and cheap prices of commodities. So is that right? I mean, we might look at that and see, okay, yeah, at one level, that's true. But behind that, again, are systems of meaning about the world. Meaning and these divisions, for example, the Great Wall of China and other national boundaries, are representing different ways of understanding and making sense of the world. Economics doesn't overcome those. So even when you do have a market, you'll still have wars erupt and divisions erupt. He's not yet getting back to, because he doesn't view humans as fundamentally cognitive, wanting understanding. He's not seeing that the divisions between humans are about that. And so he's not able to explain how those can be overcome. It's just not in here at all. The bourgeoisie is subject to the country, to the rule of the towns. This is the rise of the towns also over the country, and the conflict between urban and agrarian society. Has created enormous cities, has greatly increased the urban population as compared to the rural, and has thus rescued a considerable part of the population from the idiocy of rural life. Just as it has made the country dependent on the town, so it has made barbarian and semi-barbarian countries dependent on the civilized ones, the East on the West. So you can see his view of humans and other cultures coming out here as well. I'm not sure why he would say this about rural life, which can be quite nice, but this tension between the cities and the rural life, the tension between East and West, all of that is economic. So the bourgeoisie develops this world market in order to continue its power. And that's a theme we'll see here and elsewhere. Power is non-cognitive, not power because of truth, but power because of force. And that's why revolutions require force. The other group in charge is using force to keep you down. You have to use force to take them out. As opposed to the other group in charge is ruling on a basis of meaning, what they say is true about the world, and they might be wrong. And so you have to address them by showing that they're mistaken and where they're wrong. So then he gets to the modern movement, the modern bourgeoisie society with its relations of production, of exchange, and of property, a society that has conjured up such gigantic means of production and of exchange is like the sorcerer who is no longer able to control the powers of the netherworld, whom he has called up by his spells. For many a decade past, the history of industry and commerce is but the history of the revolt of modern productive forces against modern conditions of production, against the property relations that are the conditions for the existence of the bourgeoisie and of its rule. So you're going to see this bourgeoisie society developed the means of production, and now it's out of control, and you're going to have the conflict with the proletariat. The weapons with which the bourgeoisie felled feudalism to the ground are now turned against the bourgeoisie itself. It has put itself in the place of those it had conquered. And now it had created the proletariat, which is going to introduce, and the proletariat will overcome the bourgeoisie. So in proportion as the bourgeoisie, i.e. capital, is developed, in the same proportion as the proletariat, the modern working class, develops. The bourgeoisie operates on capital, producing capital, things that are sold, money, and that requires a working class, the class of laborers who live only as long as they find work, and who find work only as long as their labor increases capital. Now, owing to the extensive use of machinery and the division of labor, the work of the proletariat has lost all individual character and consequently all charm for the workman. So, compared to someone who is a craftsman making something by hand that has individual value to them, who they then sell, which they then sell, the factory worker doesn't have that. Just putting one piece on the item as it goes down the conveyor belt over and over all day long. And so that's part of the theme I mentioned of alienation. You're alienated from yourself and society, but also from what you produce. And it becomes monotonous. Work has no meaning anymore. And that's the interesting part, is that I wonder if you could find meaning because you're working in a factory with a conveyor belt. You're able to also think about things, other things. You could have an audiobook in nowadays, listening to an audiobook, whereas the craftsman couldn't do that. He has to focus all of his attention on making this individual object. So you could maybe make a case, right, for one against the other and say, no, actually, I think this other kind of work allows me to direct my attention to other things I find more meaningful. Now it says, modern industry has converted the little workshop of the patriarchal master into the great factory of the industrial capitalist. And he mentions the patriarchy in here. The patriarchy and the family. And the rule of the father, and that this is like a little microcosm of economics. And in order to get the communist society, you have to destroy the family unit, because the family unit mirrors the larger society, where the dad's in charge of the family. In other places, he talks about how you'd have to do that. How can you overcome that influence of the family? So the proletariat goes through various stages of development. With its birth begins its struggle with the bourgeoisie. At first, the contest is carried on by the individual laborers, then by the work people of a factory, then by the operatives of one trade in one locality against the individual bourgeois who directly exploits them. So stages of this struggle in order to overcome the owners. And the development of the increase in the numbers of the proletariat is going to be a big part of the revolution. And in that, now and then, the workers are victorious, but only for a time. The real fruit of their battles lies not in the immediate result, but in the ever-expanding union of the workers. So unionization of the workers has to expand and continue to go until they're able, by their numbers, to overcome. And every class struggle is a political struggle. And that union to attain, which the burghers of the Middle Ages, with their miserable highways, required centuries, the modern proletariats, thanks to railways, achieve in a few years. And imagine, how about now, you could say the modern proletariat, thanks to Twitter, achieve in less than a second. You don't even need the highways anymore. So this growing revolution. The organization of the proletariat into a class, and consequently into a political party, is continually being upset again by the competition between the workers themselves. So there's competition between them that they have to overcome. And developing that union in order to overcome the bourgeoisie. Finally, in times when the class struggle nears the decisive hour, the process of disillusion going on within the ruling class, in fact within the whole range of old society, assumes such a violent, glaring character that a small section of the ruling class cuts itself adrift and joins the revolutionary class, the class that holds the future in its hands. So you have that final decisive hour when even the bourgeoisie, some of them, join the proletariat because they see what's about to happen. And that's going to be what brings about the final revolution. Of all the classes that stand face to face with the bourgeoisie today, the proletariat alone is a really revolutionary class. The other classes decay and finally disappear in the face of modern industry. The proletariat is its special and essential product. So the workers are the only one that will persevere. I mean, you think about that aristocracy, there are still aristocrats, queens and princes around, but they don't have any power compared to the proletariat. They're there still from the medieval world, but they're not going to continue ruling. And this is when he says, that what we quoted at the beginning of the video, all the preceding classes that got the upper hand sought to fortify their already acquired status by subjecting society at large to their conditions of appropriation. The proletariats cannot become masters of the productive forces of society except by abolishing their own previous mode of appropriation, and thereby also every other previous mode of appropriation. They have nothing of their own to secure and to fortify. Their mission is to destroy all previous securities for and insurances of individual property. That's the final. Remember, I said Marx is not just revolutions going on forever. There's a final goal to which they're going, the end of all individual property. So the previous revolutions, say the bourgeois had to overcome those before them by destroying everything and starting a new means of production, new kinds of capital. The proletariat don't just do that again and repeat what we began this with, the thesis antithesis for a new synthesis. They destroy the whole thing, all private properties, all means of securities and insurances of private property for the final revolution. So in depicting the most general phase of the development of the proletariat, we trace the more or less veiled civil war raging within existing society up to the point where the war breaks out into the open revolution and where the violent overthrow of the bourgeoisie lay the foundations for the swath of the proletariat. So is that right? Remember, he said at the beginning, there's this civil war raging that comes silent, veiled sometimes, that comes out into the hot war of a civil economic war. And all hitherto society has been based on that conflict. So he says this, the essential condition of the existence and for the sway of the bourgeois class is the formation and augmentation of capital. The condition of capital is wage labor. Wage labor rests exclusively on competition between the laborers. The advance of industry whose involuntary promoter is the bourgeoisie replaces the isolation of the laborers due to competition by their revolutionary combination, due to association. The development of modern industry, therefore, cuts from under its feet the very foundation on which the bourgeoisie produces and appropriates products. What the bourgeoisie therefore produces, above all, is its own gravediggers. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable. And that's interesting because as an economist, Marx is making predictions. Economics is a social science. An economist will make a prediction, and if that doesn't come true, then the economic theory is not true. And this prediction hasn't come true. And so as an economist, Marx didn't make successful predictions, but then he might be considered a cultural commentator. And there's something called cultural Marxism. And say, well, but there's a cultural conflict still going on, and that could be what happens that produces this revolution. And that's still within his materialism. Think of how he's understanding the world. The laborers are just thinking of the world in terms of the money they get. And it's not fair, they say, and we want to have overthrow the capitalist owners. But is that really all there is to life? Or are they laboring to get some money in order to do the things that are really important, which is pursue what is good? And the good is not reducible to just satisfying your appetites and capital and private property and have an equal distribution of private property. The good has to do with the meaning of life and how to make sense of the world. The material world is not all there is. There's more to existence than that. So his analysis of history and change is limited by his materialist assumptions. And you can see from reading this, I hope, how influential those have been in the last 150 years and continue to be influential today. And what we need to learn to do is critically examine the assumptions on which that influence is based. So it doesn't require a revolution against the Marxist view. That would be using what the Marxist is doing. It requires critical analysis of the presuppositions that Marx brought to his economics, to his analysis of culture. In order to see, are these true? And if they're not true, then the analysis of culture and change and what will bring humans meaning is not true either. And so we're learning to do that by learning to think critically and identify his assumptions about the good, human nature, and what is real.